Alexa and Sabalenka became engaged in combat at this point. Everything between them was altered by this moment. There was no scream. There was no handshake. It was not even a subject of contention. Subtle, misinterpreted, and combustible, it was one pivotal moment that divided admirers, ignited timelines, and turned affection into rivalry. This moment generated sides as well as tension, ranging from silent reverence to boisterous speculation. There was no turning back once that boundary was crossed. At least not yet. Alexandra Eala was never meant to be involved in this discussion. She didn't have any TV teams following her, and she didn't have any expectations that might cause her to waver. She was still regarded by the majority of the tennis community as a promising name, gifted, disciplined, and courteous. Someone to observe afterward. However, subsequently arrived more quickly than anticipated. Eala ceased playing match by match, seeming as though she was thankful to be there. When others blinked, her gaze remained steady, her movements became calmer, and her strokes became sharper. Abruptly, the audience started to notice something strange. She didn't recoil. Every victory seemed like a silent message. She wasn't having a raucous celebration. Nobody was being provoked by her. As though she had always belonged at this level, she just strolled back to the baseline and repeated the process. Supporters started murmuring. Analysts bent over. Social media began posing the question that everyone pretends not to ask too soon since it is constantly in search of a new story. What if she's more than a fictional character? What if she poses a danger? Comparisons began at that point. At that time, the camera stayed on her face for a bit longer in between shots. At that point, her name began to appear alongside other people's. Sabalenka Aryna. It was hard to overlook the contrast. Sabalenka was a player who destroyed opponents and challenged the audience to react. He was a symbol of strength, domination, and unadulterated emotion. Eala stood for poise, endurance, and something more perilous than strength. Conviction. There must be a mountain to climb for every underdog. And Sabalenka was that mountain to the tennis community. The story developed too swiftly and noisily. Would Eala be able to withstand that degree of intensity? Would she be able to handle such pressure? Or would she shatter like so many others before her? However, this is what unnerved individuals. Eala didn't appear scared. She didn't talk carelessly. No one was directly challenged by her. However, the manner she played point after point seemed to be a subdued rejection of her position. And people were more afraid of that constraint and silence than they were by arrogance. Because being confident without making noise doesn't require permission. And the seeds of strife were sown somewhere in that quiet. Aryna Sabalenka doesn't slip into competitions. She shows up like an already moving hurricane. There is weight with every swing. Pressure is released with each yell. Every victory feels more like a proclamation than a means of survival. She doesn't need to be subtle, and she isn't. She lives in this world. She had become resilient after years of battling uncertainty, detractors, and her own feelings. She discovered how to transform turmoil into energy, how to transform rage into victories, and how to make the audience feel exactly as she did. Sabalenka did more than simply win games. She controlled the area. On the internet, opponents sensed it. The audience sensed it in their chests. The tour was aware of it. Thus, something changed when discussions started to focus on an adolescent with serene eyes and neat handwriting. The atmosphere, not Sabalenka's words. Because winning is only one aspect of dominating. It has to do with not being questioned. And all of a sudden, there were questions every place. Supporters didn't wait for the game. They didn't hold off on holding a press conference. They started creating a narrative in real time. One comment, one video, one post at a time. For Sabalenka, this would be a true test. Eala wouldn't be afraid. Instead of playing louder, she plays smarter. Sabalenka didn't provide any of it. However, stories can propagate without authorization. Sabalenka's name was being utilized as a benchmark rather than a destination for the first time in a long time. And that's when the friction starts in professional sports. Because champions have no fear of their rivals. They worry about losing the narrative. Sabalenka remained concentrated. She continued to prevail. After points, she continued to yell. But fans saw something subtle. Moments of intensity that felt sharper, reactions that felt heavier. Was it irritation or pressure? Nobody could be certain. However, the tennis community leaned in and the stage was set. Silence and fire do not cancel each other out when two universes intersect. Instead, they erupt. It wasn't during a game. Everyone was astonished by that. There was no mishandled handshake, no disagreement on the internet, and no public altercation. Rather, it was a brief moment that was nearly missed until it wasn't. Thousands of voices simultaneously magnify an out-of-context statement, video, or reply. Timelines were suddenly overrun by comparisons. Screens alternated between Sabalenka's raucous festivities and Eala's serene smiles. Words like fear, arrogance, and disrespect started to circulate. They weren't specifically directed at either player, but they were somehow connected to both. Before either woman ever took a side, fans did. Eala was portrayed by some as the player of the future, one who could win without theatricality. Others ardently defended Sabalenka, a champion who deserved all of her power. And truth took a backseat in the midst of it all. Because perception travels more quickly than reality when using the internet. According to one post, Sabalenka was disturbed. Eala was being overhyped, according to another. Both were accepted even though neither could be verified. The language altered at that point. It was no longer about tennis. It began to sound like combat. There was no turning back once that term entered the discourse. The most bizarre rivalry can inflict harm without physical touch. Both players maintained their composure in public as the cacophony increased. No public insults, no direct jabs, and no remarks that fuel the flames. Nevertheless, the fire continued to burn. All of a sudden, Eala was under a microscope. Every error served as evidence that she wasn't prepared. Her fans used each victory as fuel. Sabalenka was under a different kind of pressure. The weight of expectations and the pressure to outperform someone she hadn't yet played. That's what imaginary conflicts cost. You are held accountable for events that never occurred. Fans quarreled non-stop. While some charged rudeness, others accused partiality. Additionally, people's initial admiration for both players, their skill, was gradually obscured by sentiment. This was no longer just hype. It was unresolved tension. Furthermore, unresolved tension is the most hazardous type since it waits and doesn't go away. And sometimes that's sufficient. This is the unpleasant reality. Aryna Sabalenka and Alex Eala did not declare war. Expectation, emotion, and imagination all contributed to the contest. However, because legacy is shaped by perspective, this does not render it meaningless. Eala discovered what it's like to be viewed as a threat rather than an opportunity. Sabalenka experienced the consequences of no longer taking power for granted. Both were altered by what people thought a match would signify rather than by the actual event itself. Perhaps there was no conflict at all. Perhaps it was a warning, a reminder of how easily fans can weaponize optimism, how quickly tales can convert affection into conflict, and how athletes frequently carry stories they never agreed to share. The animosity between these two will be evident long before the first serve if they ever cross paths. The world will then say, "It began years ago, but now you know the truth," at that point. It began with conviction, dread, and the meeting of fire and quiet. And the issue still stands. Did we start this rivalry or was it unavoidable? Subscribe for more cinematic analyses of women's tennis rivalries, emotions, and events that altered everything if you like this in-depth look at tennis drama and untold tales. However, stories can propagate without authorization. Sabalenka's name was being utilized as a benchmark rather than a destination for the first time in a long time. And that's when the friction starts in professional sports. Because champions have no fear of their rivals. They worry about losing the narrative. Sabalenka remained concentrated. She continued to prevail. After points, she continued to yell. But fans saw something subtle. Moments of intensity that felt sharper, reactions that felt heavier. Was it irritation or pressure? Nobody could be certain. However, the tennis community leaned in and the stage was set. Silence and fire do not cancel each other out when two universes intersect. Instead, they erupt. It wasn't during a game.